She stood on the palace walls as dust clouds rose on the horizon, watching the Roman legions advance in their terrible geometric precision. This queen, whether Boudica surveying the final battlefield, or an unnamed Gallic sovereign seeing her kingdom's last day, understood what awaited beyond simple military defeat. The Romans didn't just conquer territories, they dismantled identities. And for women who wore crowns, the aftermath of conquest carried brutalities designed specifically to destroy every fiber of their former sovereignty. The weight pressing down on her shoulders wasn't just her ceremonial robes or the crown that had passed through generations. It was the knowledge whispered among defeated peoples, stories that traveled faster than Roman roads, tales of what happened to queens who fell into imperial hands. Surrender offered no protection. Resistance guaranteed nothing but a different flavor of suffering. The choice between death in battle and captivity wasn't really a choice at all. What Roman generals and soldiers did to defeated queens followed patterns refined through centuries of conquest. A systematic approach to breaking not just bodies but the very concept of royal female power that might inspire future resistance. From the moment palace doors splintered under battering rams to the final erasure of their names from historical record, these women experienced calculated destruction that served both personal gratification and state propaganda. The palace gates shattered inward with sounds that echoed through marble halls, where councils had once debated policy and children had played among columns. Roman soldiers poured through breaches in walls that had stood for generations, their gladi already bloodied from guards who'd made futile last stands. The methodical clearing of rooms, the systematic slaughter of defenders, the professional efficiency of men who'd done this dozens of times before across dozens of kingdoms. They found her where queens were always found when palaces fell, attempting to flee through secret passages, or standing defiant in throne rooms, or surrounded by the last loyal guards whose bodies would soon litter the floors. Rough hands seized arms that had never known common touch. Soldiers' fingers digging into flesh accustomed only to silk and ceremony. The grabbing itself was violation, the first of countless boundary destructions that would follow. Before they even left the palace, they stripped away her royal garments, every layer of authority physically torn away. The crown was yanked from her head, often with hair still tangled in its metalwork. Purple-dyed robes reserved for royalty were ripped off, sometimes carefully to preserve them as trophies, sometimes shredded in deliberate desecration. Jewelry wasn't removed. It was wrenched off, leaving bruises and bleeding where clasps broke skin. They dressed her in coarse slave cloth or left her in undergarments, the exposure itself a statement of her new status. That first night in captivity marked the transition point, the moment when the reality of defeat became viscerally, intimately clear. Confined in her own palace dungeons or in military tents pitched in her former gardens, surrounded by the sounds of her city being systematically plundered, these women faced assaults both physical and psychological. Soldiers celebrated conquest on the bodies of the conquered, and officers claimed defeated queens as particularly prized spoils. The violence wasn't random chaos but assertion of total domination, sexual subjugation mirroring political subjugation. Transport to Rome could take months, long overland journeys or sea voyages, where captive queens traveled in conditions designed to emphasize their fall. Chained in wagons or ship holds, fed sparingly, denied privacy for basic bodily functions, they were systematically reduced from sovereigns to cargo. Guards rotated shifts watching them, ensuring no moment of dignity or solitude, no opportunity to maintain the internal sense of self that might preserve royal identity. The deliberate breaking of will during these journeys involved sophisticated cruelty beyond simple physical hardship. They were forced to watch as treasures from their kingdoms were inventoried and packed, as their people's sacred objects were treated as plunder, as maps of their territories were redrawn with Roman names. Guards described in detail what awaited in Rome, the triumph procession where they'd be displayed, the crowds that would mock them, painting pictures designed to instill terror and hopelessness during the long journey. Preparation for the Roman triumph transformed captive queens into living propaganda sculptures. In holding cells beneath the city, specialists dressed them in costumes that combined exotic foreign elements with deliberate humiliation. They were adorned with chains, but chains made of gold or silver. Expensive bondage that aestheticized captivity for Roman audiences. Makeup was applied to make them look either savagely barbaric or unnaturally pale with fear, depending on the narrative generals wanted to construct. The procession route through Rome followed a path designed for maximum exposure and symbolic meaning, winding through streets where hundreds of thousands of citizens gathered to witness imperial power made flesh. The captive queen walked or rode in a special cart, positioned in the triumph sequence to emphasize the magnitude of conquest. Behind came the soldiers who defeated her kingdom. Ahead went displays of conquered treasures and weapons. She was contextualized as object, as trophy, as symbol rather than person. Display before Roman crowds meant enduring hours of concentrated degradation, while multitudes stared and jeered. Citizens threw rotten food, shouted insults in Latin she might or might not understand, reduced her to entertainment. Children were lifted on parents' shoulders to see the defeated foreign queen, learning from living example what happened to those who opposed Rome. The triumph wasn't just celebration. It was education, propaganda, and ritual all merged into spectacular street theater. Cleopatra Selene, daughter of Egypt's last pharaoh Cleopatra VII, and Mark Antony, walked in Octavian's triumph as a child, displayed alongside her twin brother and effigies of her dead parents. The girl who should have inherited Egypt instead paraded through Roman streets as proof of her mother's defeat, her childhood sacrificed to imperial messaging. Though later married to a client king, her girlhood trauma served political purposes, showing mercy could follow total victory, but only on Rome's terms. Zenobia of Palmyra, the queen who'd briefly carved out an independent empire in the east, was paraded through Rome in golden chains so heavy she needed support to walk. The extravagant bondage made a specific statement. Even her captivity was valuable, her defeat so significant it warranted precious metal restraints. Accounts describe her beauty, emphasized through costume, her foreign exoticism displayed while her power was narratively neutered, transformed from threatening warrior queen into contained, decorative captive. The psychological warfare of public humiliation operated on multiple levels simultaneously. For the captive queen, it destroyed any remaining sense of dignity or authority, forcing her to experience her own debasement before massive crowds. For Roman citizens, it reinforced beliefs about imperial superiority and the natural order of Roman domination. For other potential enemies watching from afar, or living as subordinate allies, it sent unmistakable messages about the consequences of defiance. The crowd's reactions were carefully orchestrated parts of the ritual. Citizens were expected to cheer, to mock, to demonstrate proper Roman contempt for defeated enemies. These weren't spontaneous expressions but cultivated responses, shaped by cultural expectations about triumph ceremonies. The noise itself, the roaring of hundreds of thousands of voices, created overwhelming sensory assault that compounded the captives' psychological trauma, while binding Roman spectators together in collective celebration. When the procession ended at the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus on Capitoline Hill, fate crystallized into final form. Some captive queens were led away to execution, others to permanent imprisonment, still others to slavery in elite Roman households. The decision had been made long before, but the announcement at triumph's end provided dramatic closure to the public spectacle, the last act of the show before crowds dispersed. Confinement locations in Rome varied, based on the captives' perceived ongoing threat level and propaganda value. Some were held in the Tullianum, the ancient dungeon beneath the city, where Rome kept its most dangerous prisoners. Others were confined in comfortable but completely controlled house arrest, living in quarters that resembled palace rooms but functioned as gilded cages with constant surveillance. Forced adoption of Roman dress and customs began immediately upon arrival. Captive queens were required to wear the stola and palla of Roman women, abandoning all traditional garments of their homelands. They were taught Latin, compelled to worship Roman gods, instructed in Roman social customs. Every aspect of daily life became retraining, a systematic program to overwrite their former identities with Roman-approved replacements. Systematic erasure of titles and heritage meant they could no longer use royal forms of address, could not speak of their kingdom's histories except as Roman provinces, could not practice the religions or cultural traditions that had defined their people. Guards corrected any assertion of former status. Documents referred to them by Roman names, not birth names. Their past was rewritten in real time, their personal histories replaced with Roman narratives about barbarian queens civilized through conquest. Surveillance and control measures ensured no privacy, no moment unobserved by Roman eyes. Guards rotated constantly, preventing formation of sympathetic bonds. Visitors were restricted or forbidden entirely. Mail was read if permitted at all. Every aspect of life occurred under scrutiny, designed to prevent escape, suicide, or maintenance of any independent identity separate from Roman control. Isolation from homeland and supporters inflicted profound psychological damage that physical torture might not achieve. Cut off from news of their kingdoms, unable to communicate with family or former subjects. These women existed in informational voids where they couldn't know whether resistance continued or cultures survived. The Romans understood that uncertainty was its own torture, that isolation amplified despair. Children taken and Romanized added another layer of identity destruction. Sons were raised as Roman citizens, trained to serve the empire that had conquered their birthright. Daughters were married to Romans, or client kings as political tools. Captive queens watched their children forget homeland languages, adopt Roman ways, essentially become the enemy. This generational erasure ensured the conquered royal line would end not with execution, but with assimilation, complete dependency on captors for every basic need. Food, water, shelter, clothing. Infantilized former sovereigns who'd once commanded armies and administered kingdoms. This enforced helplessness was strategically maintained, ensuring they could never regain autonomy or agency, could never return to the psychological state of self-determination that had once defined their royal identity. Sexual violence as conquest trophy was fundamental to Roman treatment of defeated queens, not aberration, but expectation. The logic was brutally simple. These women had ruled men, commanded soldiers, exercised sovereign authority. Raping them reasserted patriarchal and imperial dominance simultaneously, using sexual violation to emphasize total conquest of both kingdom and queen's body. Forced concubinage arrangements sometimes formalized ongoing sexual exploitation, with captive queens essentially enslaved as sexual property to generals or elite Romans. These weren't marriages even in the loosest sense. They were ownership arrangements where the woman had no legal rights, no ability to refuse, no protection under Roman law that extended full personhood only to citizens. The relationship structure itself was designed violation. Generals claiming defeated queens as personal property treated them as living trophies more valuable than gold or territory. Julius Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra VII began in this power dynamic, though her unique position and political utility complicated the typical pattern. More common were unnamed queens who simply disappeared into Roman households, their fates unrecorded because enslaved women didn't merit historical documentation. Daily reality of sexual slavery meant rape wasn't a single traumatic event, but ongoing condition of existence. Whenever the owner desired, however he desired, with no concept of consent because legally, these women were objects, not people capable of granting or denying permission. The constancy of sexual access maintained the power dynamic, ensured the captive could never psychologically stabilize or begin emotional recovery. Pregnancy, as further subjugation, trapped captive queens in biological consequences of their sexual enslavement. Children born from rape complicated their already impossible situations, creating bonds to their captivity and giving captors additional leverage for control. Some women were forced to bear multiple pregnancies, their bodies used for reproduction as they'd been used for sexual gratification. Autonomy destroyed on cellular level. Legal non-existence allowing abuse meant Roman law provided no recourse, no protection, no recognition of harm. Enslaved people couldn't testify against citizens in court. They had no property rights, no bodily autonomy, no legal personality. This structural invisibility enabled limitless abuse because nothing done to them counted as crime under the legal system that governed their captivity. Psychological destruction through sexual violence achieved what physical chains couldn't: the internal collapse of self-worth and identity. The Romans understood that sovereignty was as much psychological as political, that making someone experience themselves as utterly powerless and violated destroyed the internal sense of authority that had enabled them to rule. Sexual violence was weaponized specifically against that internal royalty, aiming to kill the queen inside, even if the woman survived. Those selected for execution faced death, timed for maximum propaganda impact, usually at the conclusion of triumph ceremonies. The most dangerous captives, those whose continued existence might inspire resistance or whose deaths would send the strongest warnings, were marked for ritual killing that served as final punctuation to the conquest narrative. Vercingetorix's wife remains unnamed in historical sources, her identity consumed by her husband's more famous story. But she likely faced the same fate that awaited captured families of major resistance leaders. The Tullianum prison, where Rome's enemies spent their final hours, was a small underground chamber, accessible only through a hole in the ceiling. Prisoners were lowered into darkness to await execution by strangulation, their last moments spent in the same dungeon that had held countless earlier victims. Ritual strangulation after triumph was the traditional execution method for conquered leaders displayed in triumphal processions. The timing was specific. While the victorious general made sacrifices at Jupiter's temple, the captive was killed in the dungeon below. The juxtaposition of religious celebration above and ritual murder below created symbolic synchronicity, linking military victory with divine approval and human sacrifice. Public execution as spectacle occurred less frequently for queens than for male leaders, perhaps because Rome's propaganda needed living symbols of tamed foreign femininity more than dead martyrs who might inspire sympathy. But when queens were executed publicly, their deaths became theatrical events attended by crowds who'd earlier watched their humiliation in triumph parades. Death completed the narrative arc from sovereign to defeated to erased. Burial denied represented the final indignity, the last erasure. Executed captives were sometimes thrown into the Tiber River or left in unmarked mass graves rather than receiving funeral rites their cultures considered essential for proper afterlife. This denial of death dignity served both practical purposes, preventing tombs from becoming resistance shrines, and symbolic ones, ensuring even in death they remained unpersoned, unremembered, unmourned by Roman society. Historical memory manipulation meant that Roman sources recorded these women's stories from conqueror perspectives, if recording them at all. Most remain completely unnamed, reduced to phrases like the captured queen or wives and daughters of the defeated. Their own voices, their experiences, their perspectives on their treatment vanished, replaced by Roman narratives about barbarian women, civilized or justly punished through conquest. How Rome portrayed these acts in official narratives framed sexual violence, enslavement, and execution as natural consequences of resisting Roman power, as evidence of imperial strength rather than systematic brutality. Triumph ceremonies, monuments, and written histories celebrated the taking of captive queens as glorious achievements, transforming trauma into entertainment and atrocity into virtue through the alchemy of propaganda. Artistic depictions reinforcing domination filled Roman visual culture with images of conquered women in chains. Submissive postures contrasted with victorious generals standing over them. Sculptures, relief carvings, and coins circulated these images throughout the empire, creating visual vocabulary that normalized gendered imperial violence as natural order. Each repetition reinforced ideological frameworks, justifying the subjugation. The lasting impact on conquered peoples reverberated through generations as cautionary tales, as inherited trauma, as historical memory of what defying Rome could cost. Communities that had watched their queens paraded in chains, enslaved, executed, or erased learned lessons about power that shaped their future interactions with imperial authority, creating cultures of compliance born from witnessed brutality. The complete story of what Roman soldiers and generals did to defeated queens reveals systematic patterns of violence designed to destroy not just individuals, but the very concept of sovereign female power that might challenge imperial authority. From public humiliation to sexual slavery to execution, these acts served intertwined purposes of personal gratification, political messaging, and cultural domination that extended far beyond military conquest into comprehensive annihilation of identity. If this deep dive into history's darkest chapters has opened your eyes to the human costs of empire, hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations of the unwritten wounds that shaped our world.